This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. From Microbe TV, this is TWiV, This Week in Virology, a special episode recorded on July 21st, 2023. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast all about viruses. Joining me today here in New York at the incubator, David Tuller.
Hi, Vincent. How you doing?
Welcome back.
Thank you. It's been a while.
I have it written down here. You were last here on October 13th, 2021.
Oh, really? Okay.
Almost 2 years, I guess.
Right.
And you were actually the first guest at the incubator.
Oh, really? Oh, in the space. You mean in the physical space? I remember that, which was a few years ago.
Yeah,
was that then?
No, we had been in it for about a year.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so, David, you are still Senior Fellow in Public Health and Journalism at the Center for Global Public Health at the School of Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley?
Yes, I am. I still have that title, yes.
Okay.
I do still have that title, yeah.
All right, so we have a lot of new listeners, and I just want to explain to them how I know you. And that
I'm not a virologist.
You're not a virologist. Why are you here and all of that stuff? So you write for Virology. Well, you're a journalist.
Right.
You have been a journalist for many years.
Right.
Covering the health beat mainly?
Yeah, I was covering health, and then I was editor. I was at the San Francisco Chronicle, and then I wrote a lot for the New York Times covering health stuff. And then I decided to go to public health school at Berkeley, so I got first a master's and then a doctorate, a DRPH, not a PhD, but a doctorate of public health. It's sort of a interdisciplinary public health degree. And in the course of that, you and I connected because there was a whole period where I started writing about chronic fatigue syndrome at the time around when they thought it was XMRV, the mouse retrovirus, and you had written on your blog about that. And so I interviewed you once, and then we sort of got to know each other, and then I had some long things related to chronic fatigue syndrome or myalgic encephalomyelitis, now frequently called ME/CFS, although these are probably all a cluster of related things that look together rather than one thing. So that's how we got to know each other. And then I started publishing regularly on Virology blog about that disease and then other things.
So I remember you had a 50,000-word piece that you had written.
Yeah, 15,000.
15?
Yeah, not 50, no. That's 15,000 words.
Which you published in 3 segments on Virology blog. It was like a history of...
Yeah, well, it was kind of like looking at this one particular trial, the PACE trial, which was published first in The Lancet in 2011 and then in other journals. That was sort of the kind of paper sort of supposedly showing that 2 forms of therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, a specialized form for this illness, at that time mostly called chronic fatigue syndrome, or sort of a graded exercise therapy, which was increasing your activity gradually, were, potentially curative treatments for it. So that was a long piece that I wrote and that you allowed me to hijack your space to report on, mainly because I think Vincent had become clear during the XMRV situation that there really was viral implications. It wasn't completely out of nowhere that this is sort of often a post-viral condition that people get. So I think that was probably where your interest came from.
Yeah, it was originally from XMRV. I wrote quite a bit on that. But then, yes, as I began looking more at ME/CFS, it became clear that a lot of patients remembered the onset of ME/CFS after some viral infection.
Right, and I think that was something that was always hard to completely pin down, even though it was associated with, Epstein-Barr or mononucleosis often, or, people had sort of things that they seemed to be associated with, but it was always a couple of years later or years later they'd get diagnosed, so it was always patient self-report. And I think what's happened now is obviously we've seen, even though it's been long known that viruses and other infectious illnesses often or almost always leave a small proportion of people with seemingly prolonged symptoms in their wake, and often non-specific symptoms that are hard to exactly pinpoint as to what they're related to. we've seen that on a mass scale now with long COVID, which is, again, a broad term, very inclusive, and doesn't necessarily is not necessarily many more people than maybe some of the people that we're talking about. But that many, many people are obviously having symptoms after having this acute virus for whatever reason, and they're having very prolonged symptoms that look very, very similar to those we've seen for decades in ME/CFS or CFS or ME or whatever variant of the name you're going to call it. So I think it's sort of come full circle that we've seen on a mass scale that this happens to a certain number of people after a virus. And obviously there's a lot of contention about what is the cause of that, or the causes, as well as there's always been contention, as I've written about a lot on Virology blog, over what are the causes or, and what approaches should one take to these post-viral conditions.
So you spent a lot of time writing about this PACE trial. Tell us what PACE stands for.
So PACE is one of those cute acronyms that they make up for trials nowadays. So it's not really it basically was a clinical trial. Pacing, so just to set this up, for decades now, patients with what was being called chronic fatigue syndrome, or what we call ME, but let's call it ME/CFS for the sake of that's how it's often being called now, that patients learn to pace themselves, and that pacing is just a sort of self-help strategy that patients would understand that if they overexerted themselves, they would have a serious relapse. And that symptom is called post-exertional malaise, or often in the case of long COVID, often it's called post-exertional symptom exacerbation. So basically, you do you expend a minimal amount of activity, and you have a profound relapse that's completely disproportionate to the amount of energy you expended. And, that's pretty distinctive. And in the U.S., the National Institutes of Health, the Institute of Medicine, which is now the National Academy of Sciences, did a big report in 2015 where they sort of made that symptom or that characteristic sort of the core symptom of the illness. And so that's a very distinctive thing, and it's not just kind of fatigue like people think of it. So in the PACE trial, so that's pacing, and patients learn to sort of stay within their energy envelope, as they say. It's not meant to be a treatment. It's not meant to be a therapy. Nobody necessarily expects to get better from it. The goal of it is just to not make yourself get worse through these consistent crashes. Excuse me. So PACE was basically a trial where they tested the theory that these two forms of what psychobehavioral interventions could get people better. And their basic theory was that people, after having a viral illness or some other physiological insult, an environmental exposure, or a car accident, or just a lot of stress, or maybe an emotional, a bad divorce, would sort of, especially after viral illness, they'd be in bed. They'd get very deconditioned because of depression and being in bed. Then they would try to do something and they would feel sick. So they'd think, oh my God, I still have an illness, rather than that I'm out of shape and I need to get back to work or whatever, that they have an illness. And then they get into this cycle of, this sort of vicious cycle, they say, of deconditioning and depression and sleep. Sleep is out of order, and weakening of the muscles, and it's all one big thing, and you need to intervene either with cognitive behavior therapy to sort of alleviate these anxieties and get people back to work, or with a graded exercise therapy program. So these two kind of behavioral interventions, and that these would have the potential of getting patients completely better. In other words, the theory was that whatever the initial trigger, all the symptoms were perpetuated by this cycle of dysfunctional beliefs about having an illness and unhealthy behavior about staying sedentary because you think you're going to get worse if you get better. Now, if you actually believe that the core symptom is post-exertional malaise and not just some vague fatigue, then of course we're encouraging people to sort of increase their energy levels just because that's the protocol is contraindicated essentially, because you're pushing them, you're getting them to think that their resurgences are part of the deconditioning, and they should push past that feeling, which, since we know that patients get these crashes, that will likely give them a crash. So this has been a huge debate, for many decades in that field, and the PACE trial was supposed to sort of solve it. Unfortunately, the trial engaged in really egregious, flaws in their research, including outcome switching, making their outcome measures so weak after the fact, after they collected data, that you could get worse on those two main outcome measures of physical function and fatigue and still be counted as recovered for those physical function measures at the same time. And, this is really, you can't meet outcome measures and entry criteria at the same time. If they overlap, there's a problem with the study. It's just, it's just basic logic. And that was published in The Lancet, and there was, other papers published that included these kinds of flaws. And I think, I and others created a lot of fuss about that, but that was what I started off writing to you about, was this big trial, and why, from my perspective, it was basically a piece of crap. And from the perspective of the experts that I talked to, who since have enumerated quite a few, including your colleague, former colleague, Bruce Levin at Columbia, who he did a video presentation about how not to conduct a clinical trial. So basically, but basically for some reason, these people who were the authors of it were very, very well placed in the UK academic establishment. It's also clear that if you propose, they also had close ties, sometimes financial, sometimes advisory in some capacity, to disability insurance companies. And also, they worked closely with the National Health Service often. And of course, the National Health Service in the UK, and of course, disability insurance companies would be much happier having patients be told you just need a short course of therapy of some kind, rather than that you're disabled for extended periods and need to receive a lot of compensation or a lot of, social benefits. So, there's a lot of problems wrong with the initial trial. I've called it lots of things.
You famously tore it up at some...
I famously tore it up. I was engaged in what I considered sort of academic performance art, where I was asked to, and I basically said this, trial this is what has to happen to this trial. And I did that twice. Once, the second time I was asked to do it again, and it was on video. So, and that was in London. So I thought that was the appropriate place to do it.
What did you call it? Academic performance art.
Yeah,
I like that.
That's what I referred to it at the time. So I mean, I'm obviously can be, I spent most of my time as a journalist, and I got my doctoral degree when I was in my mid-50s. So I'm, really it was. I'm not, I'm a journalist with doctoral training, but I'm not really. I don't depend on publishing in academic journals. I don't, that's not my position. Doesn't depend on that. So I'm not really. I play one on microbe TV, but I'm not really, for in my heart. I guess I would say more of a journalist, but I'm very glad to have the academic credential, because I think it does allow me to look at things from, public health professionals' perspective. And so what I see when I see these studies, because I've looked, because I know something about epidemiology, it's the claims they make based on the data they present just seems to me to be absurd.
Yeah. Now, the problem was that the PACE, the cognitive behavioral therapy and the pacing, that made its way into treatment regimens in many places, right?
Not pacing. So what they did with pacing was that they adapted what's a self-help strategy and called it adaptive pacing therapy, which automatically changes it into something that it's not. Right. You can't have a therapist monitoring your pacing. It's not pacing anymore. It's a therapist and then, so they did that, and they found, as no one would expect, it didn't make anybody better according to their things, but it wasn't supposed to make anybody better. The goal of it is not to make anybody worse so that you don't have crashes. So putting pacing and adaptive pacing therapy aside, they purported to show that cognitive behavior therapy, as their framing of it, not let's just be clear, when we talk about cognitive behavior therapy in this realm or at long COVID, it's really it's not like, you have cancer. They always say, well, the people use it for cancer, they use it for this, and they use it. Of course they do, because it's supposed to be a coping mechanism for, helping adapt to your circumstances and accepting the reality of your circumstances. If the core of the therapy is that the reality of your circumstances are not what you believe they are, in other words, that you really don't have something that's preventing you from doing more other than your lack of whatever it is to get you to do more, as opposed to something really going wrong that is preventing that, which seems to be the prevailing view of most of the, research scientists looking at both of these issues at this point, then that's a different kinds of cognitive behavior therapy than you have terrible cancer, how are we going to adjust your life to deal with it? So they always provide that as a thing, but it's specifically cognitive behavior therapy designed to get you out of having your unhelpful beliefs about the condition of your body. And so basically they purported to prove that these work. They did a lot of what I consider data manipulation, and basically in the end, they were then forced to release some data, and reanalyses were done that showed that they had, if you went by their original protocol measures, that they had null findings basically, and that they had, or very, very minimal, that they were like, just a placebo effect. The other thing they did was that even though there's no test, obviously, for cognitive behavior, for ME CFS or for CFS, there's no kind of diagnostic test. They had 4 objective measures, none of which showed any either statistically significant, or in one case, it was statistically significant but no clinically significant effect. Basically, whether people were more fit, like on a step test, whether they something called a 6-minute walking test, how far they could walk in 6 minutes, whether they got off their status on social welfare benefits and their employment status. Those all had either null or extremely minimal effects. They decided after the fact that their objective measures were not objective after all, so they didn't really have to pay attention to them, and they just focused on the subjective outcomes, which is overall the huge problem with all of these trials, which is that they are basically unblinded studies, open label studies, and they rely completely on subjective outcomes. Now, it's very hard to blind graded exercise therapy so that's understandable. But when you have objective measures and then they don't show what you think, the appropriate conclusion is to wonder whether your subjective measures might be showing bias, not to decide that all your objective measures are just completely wrong, and that's what these people seem to do over and over again.
Now, for many years, you worked with an organization or wrote about NICE, which writes guidelines for this sort of thing. And what's happened with that over the years?
So what happened with NICE stands for the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. I always it's one of those acronyms they came up with, I think, after they had the NICE. So I think, and yes. It's in the UK, and it's part of NHS England, but which technically covers England and Wales. But it's sort of respected in other parts of the United Kingdom, and then other countries also look at it very favorably. They do clinical guidelines for different conditions, and they do analyses or systematic reviews of the literature for X and X treatment for such and such condition, and then they're very widely respected. And so in the UK for quite a couple of decades, there's this group of psychiatrists and mental health people and other clinicians who have supported this kind of downward vicious cycle paradigm for what was being called chronic fatigue syndrome. And in 2007, they did a guideline, NICE did a guideline in which they recommended these 2 treatments for this illness. And it was dominated by people who believed that because they set themselves up as the experts. And so 10 years later, it came up for, is it time to review it? And because of the PACE trial and because of other things, there was sort of, when they surveyed sort of the normal, I call them the usual suspects, but they surveyed sort of the group of standard experts who all said, no, it's all fine, the same thing is fine. But then, there was a lot of resistance against that, and other stuff came up. And so they decided to do a review, and they put together a panel that was very excruciatingly balanced between proponents and people who were known to be or thought to be proponents and opponents of these perspectives. And they came up with in 2021, October, they published the new guidelines, which basically said no graded exercise therapy, and cognitive behavior therapy should only be offered as supportive care, and just if people are having trouble with, whatever, and not based on the idea that they're deconditioned and that they have to get undeconditioned. So basically, it had reviewed all the literature and found that all the studies offered evidence that was either a very low or in some cases just low quality. And so there's been a lot of pushback about how they did that and whether, basically there's a certain number of people, it's basically looking at post-viral illness and saying, we've looked at it this way for all this time, that it's basically many of these people are having, anxiety and depression disorders, and they're just not, behavioral patterns that aren't helpful, or all these people have something really going on in their bodies in some way that we really need to figure out what's going on. And those two things have been sort of contesting, and, it's two different paradigms or two different ways of looking at it. And so basically the NICE looked at that and found the evidence in favor of one, and the people on the losing side of that have since then been having collective whining and publishing letters, and have just published a long thing, which again repeats the same arguments that they have been making, but are just I find unpersuasive. And I think everybody realizes that the stakes are that this also involves long COVID, because anything that's said at the moment about ME/CFS. So these were new NICE guidelines for ME/CFS. In 2007, they called it CFS-ME. Now they're calling it ME/CFS. And they basically reviewed all the data. A couple of people quit the committee, or 3 people quit the committee who were clinicians, and that was taken as a sign that they disapproved. So there's been a lot of writing, about it, and I've written about it, and lobbying. I wrote I organized a long letter with dozens of experts to the head of NICE, urging her to, keep the guidelines that they had. They had a draft guideline, and they hesitated. They held off publishing them for a couple of months while they had a roundtable to try to get everybody on board. But anyway, since they've been published, there's been constant pushback from the same group of people, including many of the people that I've been pushing on for the last, since 2015 when I published my first. Among the PACE authors are those among those pushing back.
Right. So, David, before we move on to long COVID, so how do you get diagnosed with ME/CFS?
Well, so basically, there's quite a few case definitions. So part of the problem has been, what is it when you don't have a diagnostic test for, like a HIV test? It's very hard to tell, and it's symptom-based, so it's a syndrome kind of, because it's based on descriptions of symptoms. It's very hard to tell. So basically, if you go to a clinician who's experienced in seeing patients with these sorts of conditions, they might do certain. Well, there's one test that can be hard on patients, but that is sort of is used like if patients need evidence for disability claims. It's a 2-day cardiopulmonary exercise test where you do it one day and then 24 hours later. And if you are there's a particular pattern for people who suffer from post-exertional malaise or that kind of relapse, is that on the second day, the first day they might compare comparably. On the second day, their outcome of CO2 and oxygen is much different from people who are just healthy or sedentary controls but don't have post-exertional malaise. So that's a way that it can be distinguished. But most people don't want to go through that, one, because it gives them a relapse, two, because it's expensive and all that. So, a doctor, a good clinician will sort of talk to you about the different aspects of these relapses and so on and so forth and how they happen. And they'll also talk to you other kinds of symptoms are having disordered sleep, like you never really get restful sleep. Many or most people have what they call brain fog, has gotten very common now in talking about long COVID, but people with ME have been talking about it for a long time. So that's just cognitive, memory problems or cognitive, difficulty finding words, problem with concentration.
Is there also a POTS test that can be done? Yeah.
So basically, then you also might get some sort of orthostatic intolerance of some form, which means basically it's hard for you to stand up, and that might be for something like POTS, where they have a kind of a tilt table test that they can use. to see if that, and POTS has some medications, and that basically means your heart rate goes crazy.
What is it? Positional orthostatic tachycardia, right?
It's postural, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome.
So you stand up and your heart begins.
Yeah, your heartbeat, and so and so there's various things that can be done about that, and it's not really clear why that seems to follow infectious diseases, but that can also. Get many don't test for that, and they attribute those things possibly to anxiety, possibly just to exhaustion or fatigue. But so it's really important to know, see clinicians who are sort of used to these things, and each of the symptoms can have some sort of treatment for it. So the management strategy that's currently recommended by NICE is sort of managing the symptoms as best as possible, because we don't really know at this point what's causing the underlying thing. And the studies that purport to show that cognitive behavior therapy or graded exercise do, even though they're been highly promoted by a group of, I think people who really are on the wrong track, and by supporters of theirs in the media, really don't offer the evidence that they work in any degree. Now, the problem with long COVID is that long COVID is that really such a huge thing. It's anybody with any reported symptoms after a bout of COVID. So what
how long after is that? The length of time matters, right?
Well, the length of time matters because some of the studies say, well, if it's 2 months, or 3 months, and you still might be, most people get better from a viral illness. I had bronchitis when I was in my early 30s, and I was exhausted still 3 months later. And I was worried but no, that was just, I had a particularly long post-bronchial recovery, and then I was all better. So I think people sometimes confuse, even it can be 6 months, it can be up to a year, they confuse what's a natural recovery with either the intervention that they did, which they say made them better, or they think they have something and then they did something and that's what they attribute the recovery to. And often people are just in the process of getting better, but there's obviously a lot of people, what actual percentage will vary depending upon how you measure it, that after an acute bout of COVID-19, for whatever reason, have extremely prolonged, going on years, profound, non-specific symptoms like these like post-exertional relapses, like again, brain fog or sort of still cognitive, kind of concentration or memory problems, that kind of thing. Profound exhaustion with these relapses, and probably some sleep problems and possibly other things going on. And that for some of them, maybe, they could use cognitive behavior therapy or some form of therapeutic intervention. But, I don't think for most of them, I'm not a doctor, but I don't see any evidence that these are really amenable by cognitive behavior therapy or graded exercise therapy, except for those people who really genuinely are deconditioned. And that's what's causing the problems. But that doesn't seem to be why so many doctors who are formerly hardworking can't work anymore, or why all these people who are formerly hardworking, are unable to work. I don't think it really makes a lot of sense.
So if a lot of ME/CFS is post-viral, so COVID is a viral illness, so it's just another virus that's. Can we say it's another virus causing ME/CFS, or are the symptoms different enough that it should be called PASC or long COVID?
I think it's really, I think that you see different, and I try to be careful about this because I'm not a patient. I'm not in the patient community. I'm a journalist kind of, and with public health training kind of writing about this. And there's different groups. And that, one of the problems is that there's so many different definitions of ME, and there's one, there's one from the CDC from 1994, and then there's one from this Institute of Medicine thing from 2015, and there's a one called the Canadian Consensus Criteria for ME/CFS from 2003, which many use as better than, but then there's another one which is just an ME criteria from 2011, and some patients really prefer those. And so it's very hard to sort of parse what even is ME exactly, except it seems to contain this cluster of symptoms defined somewhat differently in all these definitions. So depending upon which clinician you see, which study you're in, it will be defined. And these are probably all slightly different conditions. So I think the idea is that not everybody, but many people believe there's not one virus causing it.
Sure.
Some people might believe still that there is one virus causing all these things, or some people really believe a lot of it's mold related, and some of it may be mold related. People report that after mold. But I think in the viral domain, it seems like multiple things can cause multiple kinds of problems, and so we don't really know. There's clear overlap with the descriptions of what patients with many patients with long COVID report, and specifically some form of post-exertional symptom exacerbation or post-exertional malaise, the brain fog, reports, sleep disordered, and also a lot of orthostatic intolerance. I mean, those really overlap. And many patients with these, again, not patients who have specific, lung damage or who have post-ICU syndrome. A lot of long COVID patients will have recognizable things that are accounting for their symptoms. So we're talking about the core, a group of however many long COVID patients who have these nonspecific symptoms that seem to overlap with many other post-viral syndromes. Whether those are all the same, whether those are all clusters of things, there's probably clusters of related things that hopefully the research into one will give insight into the research into the other, into the others as well. So I think there's a reason to look at these sort of as a cluster while still keeping in mind that at least here's a cohort where we know that many, if not most of them, were infected, and this was after this particular virus, whereas in most cases, patients with ME are diagnosed years later, and because they've gone from doctor to doctor to doctor being told they're depressed or something else, or being given bad advice. So I think this does provide sort of a natural history available to researchers to look at it in a way that hasn't been, and some of that's going on and probably not enough.
Well, I think long COVID has brought a lot of attention now and funding to post-viral syndromes that wasn't available for ME/CFS, right?
Yes, I think it's really ironically, I think what I felt when we were first talking about this and I was first writing about this, it was kind of like this thing that meant something to like a few group of people, but nobody else had any idea what anybody was talking about or why you'd even want to think about it. And suddenly in 2020, the more and more articles about ME, ME/CFS, and many more articles starting to link these prolonged symptoms to ME/CFS, and then a lot more attention to long COVID. And, a lot of mixed feelings. I think a lot of patients with ME or ME/CFS were gratified that they were getting attention, at the same time just being understandably angry that all these years they've been saying the same things, but were treated like they were Looney Tunes often, or like they were, just having that they didn't really have anything wrong with them in a way that could be treated by medicine. I think it's been a mixed bag, but I think overall, yes, I think it's brought a lot more attention to the overall construct, and I think it's become clear that a lot more people are having these kinds of illnesses because of COVID, and it's kind of hard to avoid when, there are so many reports.
So you've been writing about long COVID, right? So when David Tuller writes about something, there's something going on. So are the PACE people insinuating themselves?
Well, so basically, it became very clear early on, in the spring of 2020, or that to the entire ME community or people involved in it, that there was coming this pandemic, and that there was likely to be a wave of people with non-specific infections after an acute episode, and that they were going to have trouble because they, like patients with ME/CFS before them, were going to be told that you need to see a psychiatrist, or you need to see, it's just anxiety. And nobody is downplaying anxiety, and you tend to say that it's just depression. I've suffered from clinical depression. I know what it's like. I've also had 2 boyfriends who were psychiatrists. I'm still good friends with both of them. So I'm not anti-psychiatrist. I'm not denigrating anybody with mental health or anything like that. But that gets the constant refrain that you get if you challenge the construct that these really profound and devastating symptoms that people have are not being caused in many or most cases by depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. You seem unable to make that argument without then having it said to you, well, you're denigrating mental health, or you're denigrating people, or you're suggesting mental health isn't real. I'm not. I suffer from clinical depression. Let me repeat that. And so I am not in any way denigrating the reality of mental health. But I do not think that that's what we're seeing here is a mass affliction of mental health. I think we're seeing a mass affliction of people who have something other than mental health issues going on, and that's why they can't work, and that's why most of them are having devastating symptoms. So I think that I started, so people with ME or aware of that started predicting that very early on, and your colleague Mady Horning and I wrote a piece about that that published May or June that year. And then you started hearing all the reports of long COVID or of prolonged symptoms, or, it wasn't being called long COVID then, but just of these prolonged symptoms. And at first it was just going on 2 or 3 months, longer than a standard post-viral thing. So that might still be going on, whatever. But, then you really started hearing people by the fall having reports of similar kinds of things being dismissed. Well, they didn't have a viral test. Well, they couldn't get a viral test. They were told not to go get a viral test. Of course they didn't have a positive viral test. Things like that, but not really being, believed that this was actually an effect of being infected. And of course, in some cases it wasn't. Everybody was anxious, so it's a question of what are you going to believe the preponderance of the evidence shows or suggests. So anyway, nobody's saying that, the anxiety and, stress, of course that makes everything worse. And of course people have panic attacks. Nobody's disputing any of that. But you started to see more and more of these reports, and then, it just looked and sounded like, what people would say about ME, except it was all happening in real time. And then you started seeing all the people, the PACE authors and their colleagues and all the people who were sort of seeing themselves losing out on this, gradually since, I would date it since 2015, when the Institute of Medicine put out a report, and the NIH at that point, National Institutes of Health, also put out a report the same year saying that this is a, this is a devastating illness about ME/CFS. So I think they were gradually losing control of their narrative starting from then. That was also when the Virology blog published my first big thing, and when there was a court case started to be gone through that was going to result in release of the PACE data. So I think by the time the pandemic came around, things were not moving in their direction, and they all started making the exact same arguments about post-viral conditions and, post-viral fatigue, now they call it, and basically suggesting exercise and its anxiety, and, now cognitive behavior therapy. And so that's been a big, and the NICE process was happening to revise the ME/CFS guidelines was happening during all of that. So it became a big kind of political football, because everybody involved knew that it had implications for how long COVID would be looked at as well. And that is still going on. I mean, they're still writing articles that repeat the same arguments that have already been addressed. And this just happened a few weeks ago, and NICE came out with a very strong statement saying we completely reject these criticisms. We will, basically completely rejecting the criticisms being made by these people, what I would say, who are on the losing side of that that particular issue. And so I think for the first time they're facing sort of part of the UK medical academic establishment that was willing to stand up for them and say this isn't right. For the most part, that hasn't happened. These are powerful people, and everybody sort of rolled over backwards to pay deference to them. And so I think that's really been unfortunate, and I think it still continues in certain ways, but that's the battle.
So you have written recently quite a bit about some issues with functional neurological disorder, FND. So tell us about that.
Right, but first I just want to make one mention in this vein of the Dutch CBT trial for cognitive behavioral therapy. And
for ME/CFS?
No, for preventing long COVID,
okay.
Which also you and Daniel had discussed at one point.
Right.
And the point about that trial was that, like the PACE trial, it was basically unblinded, as is understandable, and they only relied on the subjective findings of do you feel better, or do you think you can do more? And those findings just are obviously going to be imbued with a lot of bias in any kind of study where you're combining both. It's not one or the other, it's having those two both together as your only source of data. In this trial, they also had objective findings. They had people wear at baseline and just at the first point, right after therapy, actographs or actimeters or some kind of Fitbit which measures how far you move. They didn't publish these data. And then they admitted in correspondence, or they acknowledged in correspondence, that those data had null findings and that they didn't need that they weren't there. They gave a number of reasons why they didn't need to put this data in, and they claimed basically that physical therapy and the amount of, physical activity and fatigue have absolutely nothing to do to each other, even though the main reason is anyway, so they can argue that there's no relationship between fatigue and physical activity, even though in previous studies, they've made a different argument. And it's obviously nonsensical to claim that if you have physical objective findings of how much people move, and these contradict your subjective positive findings, it's not appropriate, even if they're not your primary or secondary findings, but you still have those findings. You can't just not publish them because they're not your primary or secondary findings. The only way is if these people insist that they're completely unrelated, so they didn't have to publish them because they don't really shed light on the fatigue findings at all. That's their argument. I find this argument so ridiculous that I don't even know what to say about it. So that to me is the level of argumentation that these people are making. In the functional neurological disorder situation, we have a situation where basically there was a seminal study done and it found of what were the diagnoses at outpatient neurology clinics. And so this is functional neurological disorder it's a huge topic, and I'm talking about one aspect of it. I just want to say that patients who are diagnosed with functional neurological disorder really are suffering, really have, a terrible condition, and really deserve everybody's sympathy. And nothing that I've ever said, I hope, is not taken by anybody to mean that I am criticizing patients or that I'm saying patients don't have anything wrong with them. Absolutely not. I'm not saying anything like that. Whatever criticisms I've made have been at the ways that the investigators have reported their own research or have made claims that I feel are not really sustainable by what they've reported. So this last point is just that basically for about 10 years, so there was a big study published among Scottish neurology clinics, and they found that 5.4% or 5.5%, depending upon how you count the numbers, were diagnosed with what they call conversion disorder, which is the former name for what we now call functional neurological disorder. So that's the old kind of Freudian psychiatry name, and it's now been rebranded as functional neurological disorder, which has specific diagnostic criteria. Many more in the study, up to a third in the study, had given diagnoses, but there was some question as to whether whatever their diagnoses were could explain their symptoms. But they weren't given a diagnosis of conversion disorder. So for the last 10 years, though, the functional neurological disorder experts or domain has been citing that study in up to 50 papers as saying that the study found that functional neurological disorder was the number 2 diagnosis at neurology outpatient clinics. From the study, that depends upon it being number 16, having 16% prevalence, not 5.5% prevalence. At 5.5% prevalence in that study, it was the 8th most common diagnosis, and that's it. It wasn't the number 2, and it wasn't 16%. And so I basically made this point quite a number of times, and I started, writing to journals to asking them to make this correction. And, there's not a lot of willingness to do it because I think they basically understand that you make one correction and it really requires corrections in dozens of papers but it's just not a sustainable argument to be made from the data that's published. What they're doing is basically saying, well, we've had more modern studies and we do think because of other things that 16% might be more, blah, blah, blah. But that's not the point. They're citing a specific study that's known as the largest in the field and claiming that one shows it to be number 2 at 16%. In the original papers that I'm complaining about, they didn't write, and other studies show such and such, or that study, now they say, well, that study was old, so now we recognize that more people, so it might be 16%. So they're kind of getting away on technicalities from basically having disseminated misinformation. And now the idea that functional neurological disorders, the number 2 thing seen in, is basically the meme in the functional neurological disorder literature. And so I don't know anything about neuroscience, and I don't know anything about, whatever, but I do know that 5.5% is not the same as 16%, and I don't need to be a neuroscientist to know that number 8 on the list of diagnoses is not the same as number 2, and that if you cite a seminal study as indicating that, and you're wrong, as they are, you really should correct it. Whether or not you can later cite other data or you want to make an argument that it's confusing, make that argument, but correct what you already wrote. And they're not doing that. And I kind of find it, I find it not that surprising given that this is what I've been seeing for the last, since we started.
It's what you've been writing about ME/CFS for years, and now
it's coming up in the same thing.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that the functional neurological disorder folks, there's a lot of overlap with some of the PACE authors and so on, and they're signing on. This one article complaining about the NICE process. There's a dozen of them or more who don't necessarily do ME/CFS. But again, the long COVID, ME/CFS, functional neurological disorder, because people with, they say they're seeing a lot of patients with long COVID who, have functional neurological disorder.
Yeah.
And don't have something else, or have functional neurological disorder and have something else. So they also see their interests being, at stake here in some way.
I want to talk a little bit about, the estimates of long COVID prevalence, right? Which is a difficult question, right? That there's no diagnostic test, so a lot of self-reporting. And you wrote an article on the blog, Further Thoughts about this JAMA Network open article on estimates of long COVID, which I think highlights some of the issues here. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think so. So basically, there's always a problem with estimates, I think, in prevalence when you have something with non-specific symptoms. Which is also what I've been talking about about functional neurological disorder. So to some degree, but they've insisted that it's a rule in diagnosis, and that's what I'm sort of holding them to, because they've defined it one way, but when they talk about their estimates, they want to define it maximally. And why not? Why wouldn't you want your disorder to be number 2 instead of number 8? But you don't get to define it very narrowly in one way and say it's a rule in diagnosis, and then get to throw in everybody else without a rule in diagnosis because it makes your numbers look better. And so I think with there's a problem with, and there's differences that you want for public health purposes and for clinical purposes, right? You for public health purposes, you have different goals in terms of how you want to estimate, spending public money, and you want to make sure you include everybody. But if research, you want to make sure you don't include everybody who might have it. You want to just include people who actually, as far as really have it, so you can study them better. So there's all sorts of different ways of estimating. So one of the things I think I wrote about there was that, but a strategy, if you're sincerely looking for actual things that characterize people, it's not a great idea to take the maximal effort or the maximal definition and then use that to compare. The maximal group is going to have a very wishy-washy profile of what kind of symptoms they have. And so I can't actually remember the details of that specifically, but I think when we get caught up in a problem with long COVID, which is that it means basically everybody with any symptom after whatever period of time. And it makes a big difference if you're studying people who still have symptoms 2 years after COVID, who are, and if they have symptoms that are clearly not related to the things you expect. If you have identifiable lung or cardiac damage, that's already a different group. They're also long COVID. And the other thing is that part of the problem is that there's a lot of people with fatigue, perhaps, but they may not have, say, post-exertional malaise, depending upon how you define that. And one of the complaints about long COVID studies is doing exercise studies without really doing proper testing of whether people have post-exertional malaise or post-exertional symptom exacerbation. And one of the problems with that is that some of the people who are arguing on the side of psychosocial strain, or it's mainly anxiety and whatever, don't really think there's a specific PEM thing or a PESE thing, that it's all part of a functional process going on, not related to the actual functioning in terms of, again, everything's related to everything's functioning, it goes without saying, but that's not the driver of the disability. So, I think how you define what long COVID is going to define what the prevalence is. In the past, like in other studies, people with, post-viral symptoms at 6 months seems to be in the 10% range. And then maybe if you look at a year, again, I'm just calling this off, it's less than that. So if you think about this, it might be, that's when it first started, that's how I was sort of thinking of it, that you might have people recovering, taking a year to recover, but that then they're mostly recovered, but that if you look a year out or a year and a half out, you might end up having, 5% in some range like that. Now, again, it very well may be that, we're having waves of infection. It's happening over and over. We don't really know. There does seem to be some possibly vaccine-implicated sequelae or, whatever. Maybe we're having some of that, or maybe it's a combination of some things. I don't think we really know because we've never been in a process like this before, and it's not just a single thing episodically coming once, and then we can sort of track what happens after.
Yeah, that's a good point, because they're asymptomatic infections, and they probably can also lead to long COVID.
Yeah, or it can, that's true. So there just seem to be interesting, findings coming out. Hopefully at some point some of these findings coalesce into something that we're patients want treatments, and findings are nice, but they really want treatments that will help them. And, cognitive behavior therapy and graded exercise therapy, will be helpful for people who are deconditioned or who are really having symptoms because they're having a mental health crisis or they're really depressed from the pandemic. But I don't think that's going to be the great majority of people who are, contacting doctors at this point.
I think the fact that we have a defined window of infection with SARS-CoV-2 and followed by long COVID makes it easier to do mechanistic studies. For ME/CFS, we don't know what the original infection was. So we are beginning to learn mechanisms that might be involved with long COVID, like T-cell exhaustion or aberrant cytokine levels and so forth, which eventually will lead to some specific therapy. It's going to take time, though, which I know patients are not patient. They don't have time, right? They say, I want to be fixed now, but nothing happens quickly. The exception is the vaccines for COVID happened amazingly quickly. But for this sort of thing where there's a lot of confusion on all the levels that we've talked about, it's just going to take time.
I think that's probably true. And so again, I try to understand it from the perspective of patients who really want treatment now. But I think part of the problem with that is that that sort of vacuum allows there's a lot of there's no evidence that it's being caused by this or that or whatever these processes are or the spike protein or whatever it is.
Yep.
But at the same time, those on let's say the opposite side or making the other argument are willing to believe in processes that they can't really. Well, of course, yes, it's not definitely proved it's this or that physiological pathway,
yep.
But they don't really seem to have, very good explanations for their pathways either. So, and that doesn't seem to be a problem. And plus, they're willing to basically not be truthful about what a seminal study in their field of expertise reported, that it was, what the prevalence is.
Part of the problem, David, with self-reporting, which is what much of this is that you can't have an animal model.
Yeah.
So until you find some markers, and we don't have them for either, it's going to be very difficult because animal models are crucial.
I think that's. I agree with that, and I do think that the sort of coincidence of acute infections with COVID with prolonged symptoms will be ultimately, I hope, very helpful, and that it's happened to so many people. Will be very, very helpful in terms of making it clarifying these things. But I do also want to make clear that most people will recover, and just because you recovered doesn't necessarily mean, outside of a study, that whatever yoga or whatever meditation course or whatever treatment you got, or homeopathic treatment, was what caused you to get better. And I think people do make those attributions in ways that are very unhelpful, and then proclaim them and make them in ways that are unhelpful to the rest of people, because it's really people get better, and just because you did something at X point in time doesn't mean that's what made you get better. You probably were getting better anyway, and that was just something you did on the pathway.
Is there anything else you wanted to mention before we stop? You have written quite a bit. I should say, go to virology.ws. You write every few days, more or less.
Yeah,
right?
I'm trying to write every few days. No, I mean, I just really have been. It's just been an incredibly gratifying, project. I never thought I'd be doing it. This is now, next 9 years. At some point, I'll stop. But
I don't think you're going to stop.
Maybe, but I was going to stop, and then the same people seem to be doing the same things with long COVID. So it just seemed like I just don't really understand how they come back and say the same things again, and the same things again are invalid this time as they were the first time around. And then they have their defenders, and then I get and some things go well, and then other things don't, or they get something published, and I think, whatever. But then something else gets published, and it's sort of, I mean, I'm constantly amazed at what they'll do, but then I'm not surprised. I mean, I remember in the beginning you would say to me, they said what? They did what this time? And it's just, it's fun. It's odd to see people defend things that are, I just haven't seen. Now,
I've always been amazed at the behavior of some of the individuals you've been covering. You have one post that recently you wrote, Dutch team offers dog ate my data excuses for not reporting null objective findings. I mean, that kind of behavior.
So basically, they say, well, there's no relationship, so we don't have to report it. Then they say, well, it's not one of our primary or secondary objectives. It's listed under other objectives, so we're going to report it in a later study. As if you have, I don't really understand. I just don't really understand that response. So I also engaged with them, and I'd gone to see the Crucible in London the night before, and then I wrote a tweet saying, the argument, that's our great production of the Crucible, and the arguments for witchcraft make more sense to me than this idea that physical activity and fatigue have absolutely nothing to do with each other, and that you don't have to report that your patients did not move any farther than they did before the intervention. Again, I'm sort of a little speechless. Well, I'm never speechless, but I just still find it surprising the extent to which they can make a claim like that.
David Tuller is never speechless. No. Well, you have a lot of people reading your posts, and the length of some of the comments are really remarkable. So you should be encouraged by that, I think.
Well, I have a devoted but somewhat limited following to whom these are issues of really they're personally at stake.
Yeah, of course.
So I think that's grown a bit with long COVID, but it's yeah. I mean, I have a fair amount of engagement with a certain group of readers, and disagree with some and agree with others, and but I really enjoy it, and I felt very honored to have this, and I felt very honored to be able to be on Hijack Your Space, and because it comes with a good pedigree already. So it's just distressing to see the same kinds of reasoning still being applied in a new domain.
Sure, I understand. So I split your writing from everything else on Virology blog. I thought the two should be finally separated. I did that a few months ago.
Yeah, that seems to
So
work
now
well.
we have, if we go to Virology, we have on the top Virology, and then underneath David Tuller. So
Right.
you get your own section, and you can read each of the posts. And I thought that made a lot of sense rather than having them all mixed.
Up. I think it's helpful, actually.
But also, you're very prolific, much more so than the virologist. So
Well, I mean, but you're on doing you've segued to your TV production.
Yes,
thing
exactly
quite heavily,
right.
so that's good. I think
So in fact, now Trudy Ray writes mainly for the blog about viruses.
Right.
I have not written in a while, though, because as you said, I've been hijacked by the TV part.
Yeah, and that's great. I mean, I tell her, I come across a lot of people who are like impressed when I hear that I'm connected with, Vincent Racaniello of Microbe TV. So, hey.
We need to get you a T-shirt, David.
A Microbe TV T-shirt?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll wear one next time.
I will send it to you. What size do you need? Medium?
Medium.
All right, we'll send you one. All right, that's a special episode of TWiV. You can find the show notes at microbe.tv/TWiV. Questions and comments. Well, you can go over to virology.ws and post them on David's blogs there, but you can also send them to TWiV at microbe.tv. And if you enjoy our work, we would love to have your support. We don't charge for any of this. We don't advertise. We allow you to focus on what's being said. So we'd love your support. You can go over to microbe.tv/contribute. You know, $1 a month, less than a cup of coffee. That would be great if you could do that. And microbe.tv/contribute. David Tuller, thank you for coming back.
Thanks, Vincent.
Always enjoy your writing. I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.ws. I'd like to thank the American Society for Virology and the American Society for Microbiology for their support of TWiV, Ronald Jenkins for the music, and Jolene for the timestamps. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. Another TWiV is viral.